Well, kids, it seems like it's about time that we had that talk. And by that talk, I mean um, let's talk about roasted woods and how they relate to the musical instrument industry. Some people start their videos erroneously by saying they've been getting a lot of questions. Well, in this case, it's actually really true. Actually been getting a lot of questions about this subject. People know that I work with this stuff and that I have a little bit of background knowledge. And so I figured I'd take a minute to power through those questions and see where we can get in imparting some information and possibly even just contributing to the dialogue out there in their use of roasted woods in musical instruments. So, the first question was just to describe the process of roasting. Um, this is something that began a long time ago, and the idea was that as wood ages, whether it's on a church bench or in a barnyard outside or wherever else, as wood ages, it dries out, but that's not just a reduction in moisture content. We are talking about at a cellular level, it begins to change over time. This was first popularized in acoustic instruments prior to electric instruments because, like spruce tops, for example, they're not only drying out with age, but they're also being flexed by the strings vibration. And it's a very thin membrane. You know, you have an eighth of an inch thick of top on an acoustic guitar, and it's moving. So this was, partially an attempt to sort of recreate that, to sort of say, I want to be able to build a vintage guitar, but right now. I don't want to wait. I don't want to have to wait. Now, I was very fortunate to be friends with people in the industry who do this, who are experts, who are excellent at what they do, and who've done the homework. Going back early on, I was friends with people who were working on this stuff as it relates to the acoustic guitars, and we were even talking then about how this process in nature is destructive. So it is doing harm. It's just very, very controlled. And that's what's important, is that we're going to control it. But even as you're trying to make something behave like a vintage guitar, it's like starting off with a roasted acoustic guitar top and then starting off with a guitar that's already 70 years old. Even if you kind of get those two things to become more similar to one another, the trajectory that they're on is still very different. What's going to happen to this piece of wood over the next 40 years versus the torrefied piece of wood over the next 40 years, that's going to be different. They're going to go off on a different tangent. Doesn't make them bad, just makes them different. Now, as we move over to electric guitars, what seemed to happen is it's the same story, really. It's like I've got that 63 Strat or the other vintage guitar, and, there's something magical about it. How do I go about recreating this? And so a lot of where it gets discussed is in the use on guitar necks. I'm going to focus on that. There's a lot of use of roasted woods for bodies as well. Like I have this piece of roasted pine here. There's a bunch of roasted pine back there that I have that I'm using for a project that's coming up. That's going to be great. I've worked with roasted basswood, roasted limba, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of roasted woods for the body. But as it relates to the neck, the reason why a lot of these things are going to become important to us is because in a neck, we aren't just dealing with something static. This is where something is under string tension and it's being pulled, and its straightness now becomes paramount to the success and the life of the instrument. So let's talk about the process of roasting. What we're doing here is we're cooking the wood, but bringing it, up to a very high temperature, but starving it of oxygen so that it does not combust. What did they teach us in school, right? What does fire need to burn? Yeah, oxygen, right? So if we can limit the oxygen, if we can shut that down, then what happens is we are forcing other things to cook off. We're forcing other things to degrade without flames, without combustion. And in this case of wood, we're talking about cellulose, hemicellulose, and ultimately lignin. And I'll get to why those things are important soon. But basically, what we're doing is like I said, we're able to cook those things down without destroying all the rest of the wood, right? There are people on woodworkers forums who take their raw lumber and like put it in the oven, and the family comes home and says, why does it smell like maple syrup in here? That is not what we're talking about here. This is not something that's homegrown. This is not something you can do in your house. And it is not strictly a temperature-based process. If you're making furniture, even very fine furniture, you have an entirely different set of parameters. Mainly that as the seasons change, if you do a beautiful job making a drawer, you don't want it to be stuck in the summer. So then you want the beauty. You might want the beauty of roasted wood, right? Because it brings out figuring or brings out bird's eyes. And so that's an entirely different set of parameters. For us here in the guitar industry, we're coming at this from a completely different standpoint. No, you're not just putting wood in a kiln and raising it up to 300 some degrees and just waiting. And like I say, I'll get to those reasons in a minute. So cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin. These things are essentially the glue or the binding agent that is holding everything together, that's keeping some structural integrity in that piece of wood. Easiest way to do it is the Wikipedia, just look up lignin. Wikipedia definition: lignin is a class of complex organic polymers that form key structural materials in the support tissues of vascular plants and some algae. Lignins are particularly important in the formation of cell walls, especially in wood and bark, because they lend rigidity and do not rot easily. You caught that? They lend rigidity, right? Hang on to that piece of information. Chemically, lignins are cross-linked phenolic polymers. Almost like if you're cooking, and there's some people will put an egg in the ground beef to hold it together so it doesn't break apart and fall apart. So it's important to understand how this can be destructive. This roasting process can be destructive to the lignin and to the hemicellulose and the cellulose, because if you go too far, now you're left with something that is brittle, something that doesn't stay as stiff under string tension. It's a little rubberier, even though it's dry, even though it's, it doesn't have moisture in it. So we're not talking about green wood, like a fresh branch being rubbery. We're just talking about if too much of this stuff, like if the lignin is cooked away, to me, then it makes something that's not suitable for a guitar neck. I don't like it at that point. One question here, what does sugar content actually do? Well, honestly, talking about sugar content, that's just really a rudimentary way to refer to the cellulose and the hemicellulose. Those are the key things that we are interested in managing. In other words, we're trying to manage the destruction of those. Next up, the pros and cons of roasting. Okay, there's a slight weight reduction. It's not a big deal. If I really do have somebody focusing on the weight of an entire instrument, sometimes that can influence my decision to choose a, thermally modified woods. But it's not really, that's not the sole main determining factor. Here's the big one. When you properly temper a piece of wood, the expansion and contraction rate is about half of that of the raw counterpart. That means that in extreme temperature inversions, right, that piece of wood is going to grow and shrink by about half the rate of wood that hasn't been cooked, right? The raw wood counterpart. Again, there's some very key reasons why that's important that I'm going to hit later when we talk about wood combining. But that's a huge payoff. That's a big benefit, as it relates to musical instruments. And that's where we use the term stability, because there should be less adjustments required, because it's really not taking in that moisture of a high humid environment, and it's really not driving out, losing moisture in a real dry environment. So how long does it take to properly roast? Okay, I can't answer that, either because I don't have the information for you, or the information that I do have was told to me in confidence. But the real reason that it doesn't have a definitive answer is because it's species dependent. So there's really not a solid and concrete answer. Next up, can you change the color with temp length in order to reach the ideal end result without damaging the wood? So can you change the can you arrive at a different color but still have the same result? I would say it's better to talk about that in the inverse. let's flip that question around. The question would be, can you arrive at the same color with two disparate processes? In other words, can you reach that same level of medium brown and have one piece of wood that was done right and have one piece of wood that was done wrong, that you do not want to use for make a guitar neck? And the answer to that is yes. That's a big yes. And I'll tell you why. Go back to the example of someone just putting wood into an oven in their house, right? They're basically burning it. It's a barbecue. I can take a blowtorch to a piece of wood and turn it black on the outside. It won't be black on the inside until it burns way in there. But I can change the color a million different ways that include oxygen that are not what we're talking about doing to make a good guitar neck or a good fingerboard. Okay? So what color can do is I can't use color to determine whether or not someone's roasting process was good or not. But I can use color to determine whether or not someone's roasting process is bad. And that's very important, because if I'm looking at a piece of wood, for example, that is really dark like this one here, I know that by the time we reach this color, and I know everyone's screens are different. I'm sorry, I don't have some. I can't give you some Pantone color, on a chart to tell you to go reference, to find the perfect place or the cutoff. But dark, right? Let's just say dark. When it gets to a certain darkness, what we know is either too much oxygen was in there and it was allowed to burn and char, or any other descriptive term you want to use. Or the temperature was too high, or it was in there for too long, or whatever. And why am I saying too high, too long? Why am I acting like this should be disqualified? I'll use some darker roasted stuff at times, but as it relates to a guitar neck or a guitar fingerboard, there's kind of a limit. For me, I have an example here. This is about as dark as I'll ever use on this guitar here. This is a fretless fingerboard, and it's, by my standards, it's pretty dark. Okay, this is sort of on the dark side of roasted wood for me, the stuff that I would use, and I'll tell you the reason why I've used it. Okay, there's about 3 reasons. One is it's a fretless. That means that I'm not cutting kerfs into it, thereby establishing like these fault lines in there, allowing it to split, right? I'm not going to hammer frets into it either, which means no one's ever going to refret it, pull them out, and have a bunch of wood chip out. Another reason is because underneath here, what you don't see is I have 2 titanium reinforcement rods embedded into the neck about 2/3 of the way, but then embedded into the fingerboard about 1/3 of the way. So it actually splits the two and forms like this I-beam that's cutting into the board and into the neck. I also used epoxy to glue this fingerboard onto this neck, whereas everything else here is all wood glue, but I'll get to that in a second too. I'll tell you what I mean by that. And finally, when this is all done, I will be soaking the surface in thin cyanoacrylate, which is super glue basically. And by soaking it, I mean, I'm talking about this thin stuff going way, way down into the pores and the fibers of the wood and almost plasticizing it. So by then, the surface that this customer is going to be playing on will be very solid, very, very solid. So I'll be, like I said, I'll be saturating it. That's about as dark as I'll go. What role does oxygen play in the oven cycle? It's everything. It is how you're controlling combustion. It's why the piece of wood doesn't catch fire. Yes, it relates to the color. If you slip a little bit more oxygen into the environment, it's going to darken up a lot more quickly. But again, we don't care about that. We don't care about how it relates to the final color. I just want the process to be right, and I can tell by the color if I at least have a fighting chance of the process being right. Well, and this kind of goes on. Will going too dark affect the stability and longevity of the wood? So we do still need to quantify that. What does too dark mean? Did you become too dark because there was too much oxygen? Like you didn't even take the oxygen out, you just barbecued the wood? If so, you have charcoal. You're done. Or did you just bring it to a higher temp and hold it there longer? Therefore, the stuff we want to cook out, like I said, the hemicellulose and the cellulose, those things cooked away, didn't combust, didn't get dark because because of the oxygen, but you still achieved, like I said, a darker color. That's a little better. I will say this: if you think, let me put it like this. What color the wood is before it goes into the roasting process has very little to do with what color it is when it comes out. There's no easy way to say that. That's not it. Okay, I have some limba here that can prove that point to a certain degree. This is a piece of limba. We call it. We start to call it black limba when it has these streaks going through it, right? And so you'll notice like a very distinct difference between the light sections and these darker streaks, I should say, right? That's one of the characteristics, one of the visual characteristics of limba. This is a piece of roasted limba that would have been similar in color prior to having been roasted. And again, I can't account for your screens or how they're going to make this look. But what is obvious is that the dark sections of the limba are not any darker, okay? The light sections of the limba have turned a nice roasted golden brown. If the pigmentation in the wood was responsible for the color on the outset, then the darker sections of the limba would have become substantially darker. And that is not the case. It's just not the case. So yes, there can be slight differences in two pieces of maple before they enter the roasting process. But if you have a substantial difference in color, I'm sorry. That's a difference in your process. Let's see what's next. The effects of over and under roasting and the Goldilocks zone for roasting. Okay, we already talked about over roasting. Under roasting, right? In other words, if it really doesn't look that much different in color, again, if it doesn't look that much different in color, but we know it's because somebody also just put it in their oven and left the oxygen in there, I still don't want it. Okay, but if it was done properly and it was just done to a lighter degree, then it just means that the benefits of the roasting process have been minimized a little bit. They've been reduced. So maybe you're going to pick up some benefit of the wood being dried out, a little bit more stable, not quite as stable as what we would, consider like the perfect roast. As far as the perfection, I mean, this is a piece of roasted flamed maple, and it's actually a cutoff from this instrument. Okay, so this is the neck that ended up, this is the neck. This is the cutoff from that. So I'm going to show you something about it. What makes this perfect to me, what makes this on target, is that I have this really skinny, thin cutoff, and I can flex the heck out of it, and it does not snap. Okay, if this were over roasted, if this were cooked, then this would just give up. It would just give way and just come right off. And that's not the case. That's not happening. And it's flamed maple to boot, which means that it's much more likely to snap and crack off. So this is a piece of roasted wood that is stable, still has enough glue in it, right? Enough binding agent that it's not going to be brittle. It's not going to crack. It's not going to, it's not going to have a fault, right? I can exercise this like crazy and it doesn't break. So that to me, that's perfect. That's like the sweet spot. Weight reduction. I found already well-dried wood really doesn't change in weight at all. Yeah, it can be minimal. It's also on a per species basis. So some species will come out of roasting process with a bigger delta. They'll be more light than other species. But you're right. If you're dealing with what we would call in guitar making like wet wood, the wet wood's going to be heavy, and then all of a sudden, if you properly dry it, gets lighter, and then that last little bit of difference between that and being thermally modified may be less noticeable to you. And that's why I was saying earlier, I generally don't pick it just because of weight. I don't say this guitar has to be light. Okay, I better use some thermally modified wood. How roasting changes the surface feel. Okay, if it's going to have a finish on it, it doesn't change it at all. That's a satin finish. Or a gloss finish or whatever. So it's not doing anything in that regard. If it's going to have an oil finish where you're touching what you kind of feels like the wood, we really know there's still something on top. This is why some people will perceive it as feeling differently. Remember when I said that lignin and the cellulose and hemicellulose is basically binding agent that's kind of holding everything together, right? As you sand raw maple, there's a bit of a gumminess to it. It makes dust, but it's just a different kind of dust. When you sand torrefied wood, when you sand wood that's been thermally modified, it's a very powdery, dusty kind of dust. It's like a very talcish kind of dust, and so if you're getting a different feel on your tempered woods than you are on your raw woods, that just means you haven't mastered the art of working through different grits of paper and your sanding direction, your sanding tools. If somebody wanted me to make them a tempered, roasted maple neck, and they wanted it to feel like, the back of the neck to have the same feel as some raw maple, 1990 Ibanez gem or something like that. I absolutely, you can do that. It doesn't really, it shouldn't feel any different just because it's roasted. If it feels different, it just means that somebody's using the same sanding technique on the raw and then the same sanding technique on the roasted, and the roasted comes out, it's just feeling a little bit different because of the surface preparation, really. Let's see. How roasting compares to old, well-seasoned wood. So both are cool, both are different. Meaning, if you get that wood from the old church bench, that actually has been cut off a tree and been out there in the wild for the last 50 or 100 years, it is different. The roasting process is forcing it. It's a forced version of it. But they're both cool. They're both there's merit to both. The roasting procedure, again, if you force it and you force it too hard, then it will become brittle. Whereas the piece of wood that's been naturally seasoned and it hasn't been forced, but this is just what's occurred to it over the last 80 years, will not be as brittle. It will not suffer from that to the same extent. Can you touch on the effects of staining roasted wood? Yeah, you can put a color on them, and they'll take stain. Some people will act as though a roasted wood can't accept water, moisture, or water-based stain or oil-based stain or something. It's not true. It comes from a misunderstanding of it, where people heat treated the wood to make it not waterproof, but make it hold up better on a deck outside or something like that. And they would pressure treat or heat treat it or whatever. That's not the case. If you use wood glue on it, it accepts the moisture from the wood glue. It glues just fine with wood glue, and it'll take a stain. The problem is you're starting out at a medium brown color. So you're like the blue, blue is almost out the window. A rich blue or purple or whatever. You can spray stain over the top. You have your clear coat with color in the clear. You can do that, and it's going to get you a little bit closer. But the fact that you're already starting out with that medium caramel brown means that a medium blue is going to turn green. Your reds will favor amber. They'll favor an orangey red or something like that. So it can be done. You just have to look at the two colors as they're going to come together. Whereas like on a brand new fresh piece of maple that's very white in color, usually, that takes stain really well. You can go in with blues and purples and pinks and reds and stuff like that because the substrate, the wood underneath, isn't going to impart a lot of its own character. Is it really better than maple stock that's been properly kiln dried but not baked? Better is subjective. We use subjective terms all the time. It's maybe better if you live in an area with a bunch of climate changes. Maybe that's more suitable for you. But it's a drier sound. It's a little more likely to resonate because, again, those same binding agents that I talked about, those same glues that are holding everything together, they're also dampening agents. When something is wet down, it doesn't vibrate as much. When it's dried out, it's got a lot more ping to it. It's a little more open sounding vibration. This is just regarding vibration transference, right? And so it can have an effect on the tone, but what's better and what's not, it's entirely up to you. There is no better. I'd hate to get too brand specific, but could you go into detail a little bit on what would happen if you matched an unroasted board with a roasted neck or vice versa? I know you said they shrink, expand at different rates, and it can affect the neck. Yes. This is perhaps, this might even be the spiciest meatball in the whole conversation. For two reasons. One is that when you made up, let's just pretend these two pieces of wood were magically mated together. In other words, just take glue out of the equation. Let's just say these two things are together. Well, when the temperature and humidity are changing, when the seasons change, if the top piece, let's say this is your unroasted piece, and let's say this is your roasted piece. When this piece expands at twice the rate of the piece underneath, you're going to get this. Okay, in other words, you're going to have, this thing's going to turn into a back bow because this thing's going to be swollen at twice the rate of what's underneath it, and it's going to do this. If you went back to the neutral position and all of a sudden everything dried out, it's going to do that. It's going to cup in the other direction. So what that means is that if you have an unroasted fingerboard and a roasted neck, or vice versa, you can have a disparity. Now, I will preface that by saying that I like a roasted maple neck with an ebony fingerboard, for example. Like, I like those marriages, a roasted maple neck, rosewood board, because those woods were already expanding and contracting at a different rate anyways. Like the hardwood, like ebony, is going to, like I said, I consider it very compatible with roasted maple. Let's put it that way. So that's a nice made-up. If we're talking about a roasted maple against a non-roasted maple, where the two things are basically exactly the same aside from the roasting process, that is doable, but not without consideration. You have to be cognizant of what you're about to do when you mate those two things up. The moisture level, the humidity level in the shop when you're about to glue them together, the moisture, like I say, the moisture content of the raw wood. All those things come into play when you're going to bring those two, if you are going to bring those two pieces together. So it's not something that I would do, you take lightly. Because of over the life of the instrument, like I said, you're going to have a disparity between the way those two things move together. Now, all that said, let's back this up because they got to come together somehow. When you put Type-On wood glue on the surface of the wood, it wets the wood, and the wood immediately begins to swell up and expand. So think of the Type-On gluing process as sort of like happening in the rain, outside. It's like once you put it on that surface, it's going to blow up a little bit like a sponge. Take on that moisture, put the two pieces together, and the glue dries. So think about that one for a second with me. Let's say this piece is not roasted. Let's say this piece is roasted. So I'm going to apply glue here. This is going to swell up, get way bigger. They're going to come together, get glued together, put in a clamp. Then the glue is going to dry while this piece is larger and more swollen than this piece. So the glue dries, now the bond is formed, and now over the next day or two, this raw wood begins to return back to its baseline moisture content, meaning it's going to shrink back. So now, just because of the glue joint, you will have swollen up, jointed, clamped them flat, and then you're going to do this. And you're basically in this state now permanently for the life of the instrument. You can level the fingerboard, right? You can make it level. But a lot of extra care has to be taken when laminating roasted wood to not roasted wood, because like I said, one of them is going to get wet with the glue, swell up, the glue's going to dry, and it's going to shrink back. There's several ways to mitigate it. Like if you're putting a figured maple top on top of a roasted back or something, you can pre-cup the top. You can have air blowing over it under the underside. Whatever the roasted pieces, you can put the glue on the roasted piece first, so that's where you're spreading everything out, and that's where it's sitting. And then all of a sudden, boom! You come in with the non-roasted piece of wood, put it into place. Hurry up, get it into the clamp, tighten it, get it clamped down. Hopefully before it's really exploded, and gotten really a lot larger. So there's ways to manage that, but that's a very real thing. If you're going to make those two things together, you need to really understand what you're doing. Why is a vacuum kiln so important for torrefied wood? Vacuums, it's as it relates to oxygen. Like I told you before, my friend from a long time ago, he was experimenting even with things like nitrogen and other things where it wasn't even just temperature. He was experimenting with temperature cycles where he'd go hot and cold. He was doing those things to sort of break down the cellulose and the hemicellulose. And it was a different process. Very smart guy. Very, very. He's somebody who is not making his living in the musical instrument industry. He's a scientist, so he understands these things to a greater degree than a lot of us, jamokes who are building guitars. And so he had some alternative things as well. And, like I said, now it wasn't just oxygen starvation, or it wasn't just oxygen starvation through vacuum. He could use the vacuum to a certain point, and then as it's warming up, or as it was cooling off from the warm-up cycle, he could release a little bit of oxygen back in. He had a lot of very detailed, technique of things that he would do to try to achieve the results he wanted. Does torrefied wood have any downsides to it? I guess the only downside would be if it's cooked too much, or if you have like a very thin, slim, narrow, thin neck, where it would have been weak anyways and kind of rubbery, under string tension, and you aren't going to use any reinforcement rods, for example. Then I guess a drawback could be that the neck is a little bit more wiggly, a little bit more rubbery. We use terms in our industry like bright and dark and soft and hard and light sounding, and we use a lot of descriptive terms. So we'll throw a term out there like stable and stability. We'll say that a roasted maple neck is stable in temperature inversions, but that doesn't necessarily mean stiff. It doesn't mean that it's as though it were made from aluminum, right? It doesn't mean that it's more strong than prior to having been roasted. So there are a few drawbacks here and there. What else do I have around here? I've got this neck. I'm super excited to get this neck done. This is roasted vertical grain fir. That's a wood that you wouldn't probably necessarily use for a neck normally, but it's very strong across the string axis, right? If it's vertical grain like this, you can see them going straight up and down with the strings. I mean, these grains are basically dead in line with the string pull, and it's quartered. If you can get that, and it's tempered, so it's not going to expand and contract to a great degree, this is going to be an amazing sounding neck. Can't wait to finish this guy. Anyway, if you have any questions, you just feel free to find me on socials. I just want to keep good information out there so that all you guys can make sensible decisions on who you trust and what when and what to use on your guitars.